Good day, everyone. I am Erika Modina, a current fellow for the inaugural year of the policy program and your moderator for today. We are very fortunate to have an esteemed panel with us, and I am very excited to hear what they have to say about such a relevant topic that I think has been on the news in the past couple of weeks. So before I introduce our panelists, I will just briefly go through today's agenda. So the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law in 2022, and one of its many objectives is to lower drug prices. But again, there are ongoing debates on how this will impact the innovation ecosystem, research and development, and of course, patient outcomes. Part of this provision affects orphan drugs. Orphan drugs are used to treat, prevent, or diagnose rare diseases or conditions that affect fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. Currently, it is estimated that only about 5% of rare diseases have an FDA-approved treatment. In the IRA, drugs with an orphan designation are excluded from price negotiation, but only with a single approved indication. The CMS revised guidance indicates that a drug that has designation for more than one rare disease or condition will not qualify for an orphan drug exclusion. In response to this, the Optimizing Research, Progress, Hope, and New Cures Act, or Orphan Cures Act, aims to expand and clarify the exclusion for orphan drugs under the Drug Price Negotiation Program. So again, for today, we would like to highlight the different perspectives on this topic that might impact the biotechnology industry and, of course, patient outcomes. I cannot wait to learn from our panel today. So without further ado, it is an honor to introduce today's speakers. Cartier Esham serves as a Chief Scientific Officer and EVP of Emerging Companies at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO. In this role, Dr. Esham manages and directs policy development, advocacy, research, and educational initiatives for BIO's emerging companies, which comprise approximately 90% of BIO's membership. This includes capital formation policy and health policy impacting emerging companies, as well as research and analysis of the biopharmaceutical industry and life science investment and financing. Among the priorities of BIO's emerging companies sections are promoting a science-based FDA regulatory environment, supporting NIH funding and programs or initiatives such as SBIR and NCATS that promote the effective transfer of technology, and working to create a public and private market that incentivizes the research and development of innovative treatments and therapies. Prior to joining BIO, Dr. Esham was a vice president and a director for research at Dudco Worldwide, a private consulting firm in Washington, D.C., where she worked on a variety of environmental, education, science, technology, and healthcare issues on the federal, state, and local levels. Dr. Esham has a PhD in microbiology from the University of Georgia, a master's degree in marine biology from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and a bachelor degree from the University of Kentucky. She has published papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals on water quality, marine microbial ecology, and bacterial phylogeny. Welcome, Dr. Esham.
So thank you, Eric. I see they sent you the long bio. I'll try to live up to that, and apologies for that.
No worries. So up next, we have John Brodo. John Brodo joined Todd Strategy in the fall of 2018, where he serves as policy director. Prior to joining Todd Strategy, John served as a health policy fellow for the House Energy and Commerce Committee while completing his Master of Arts in American Government from Georgetown University. A graduate from Tulane University with a BA in Political Economy, Law, Economics, and Policy with a minor in Jewish Studies, John spent time working as a grassroots campaign operative during Louisiana's 2014 Senate election on behalf of Senator Bill Cassidy, whom he subsequently followed to Washington, D.C. as a health policy and foreign affairs intern after graduation. Presented with an opportunity to engage in the political process, John serves as the Ohio Field Director for the Republican Jewish Coalition, leading the entire Ohio operation to get out the Jewish vote on behalf of Republican candidates up and down the ballot before returning to Washington, D.C. in 2017. John was born and raised in the suburbs of Philadelphia and remains a diehard Eagles fan to this day. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Erika. Great to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation.
All right, and last but not the least, Mason is a policy analyst at the National Organization for Rare Disorders, or NORD. His portfolio includes drug pricing on both the state and federal levels, like IRA, PDABs, Medicare, Medicaid, commercial insurance, and federal telehealth. Prior to joining NORD, Mason worked on development and operations of value-based contracts for DaVita Integrated Kidney Care. Welcome, Mason.
Thank you, Erika. It's great to be here.
Again, Dr. Esham, John, and Mason, thank you so much for your time and for being here today. I am sure everybody listening in is looking forward to our conversation. So let's start off with Dr. Esham. Dr. Esham, welcome again.
Thank you.
Okay, so I know that this is probably a question that you have been asked a million times, but with the policy and research work that you are currently doing or have been doing within bio, let's start off with what are the unintended consequences or potential unintended consequences of the Inflation Reduction Act that you are seeing, researching, or hearing about, specifically for drugs with an orphan designation on number one, the innovation ecosystem, and number two, patient care.
Sure, happy to take that question. And again, first, I'd like to provide just a bit more background on the IRA. You know, as you noted, the IRA was signed into law in 2022, but that was the result of more than a decade of debate in Washington, D.C. around pricing and access to medicines. And as an organization, at Bio, we've always been focused on how we need to significantly reduce the out-of-pocket costs for patients at the pharmacy counter, while ensuring that the overall ecosystem supports continued medical R&D innovation that will improve how we cure and care for patients. Now, the IRA authorizes the federal government, as you noted, to negotiate the price that Medicare pays for certain medicines. The question we have is, will these new processes appropriately recognize the high risk, high cost of developing medicines in a manner that does not drive away the investment we need for the U.S. to continue to be a leader in medical innovation? We also want to make sure that the law actually ensures that patients themselves realize decreased expenses. So one provision I just wanted to point out that we advocated for and we're very happy to see included in the final law is one that will cap out-of-pocket drug spending for patients at $2,000 a year starting in 2025 and enable people to spread costs out over a year. But a lot more work is needed to ensure that we are best decreasing out-of-pocket costs for patients. We do have concerns generally that the law creates some downward pressure on future investments. Specifically, we're concerned about the impact of the treatment of small molecule and orphan treatments and therapies under the law. So again, as you noted the orphan thing, but there's also a provision related to small molecule oral drugs that are subjected to price controls just 9 years after earning their first FDA approval. By contrast, biologics, complex medicines derived from natural sources, aren't subject to price controls for 13 years. Now, this differing treatment is not based on science, nor was it developed in thinking about what treatments are best for patients. So it's important to understand that most pharmaceuticals on the market today, including, for example, at least 89 anti-tumor drugs for treating cancer, are small molecule drugs. So for neurological disease like Alzheimer's, small molecule medicines offer our best hope as breakthroughs for the future. It's also important to note that a lot of research, not just on orphan drugs, but a lot of medicines happens after they earn FDA approval. So that's when scientists can perform additional tests, discover how new uses for medicines that sometimes happen over the course of a decade or more. And it's not uncommon for a medicine to treat one disease can prove highly effective at treating other forms of the same or different diseases. So we are concerned generally that this may drive funding away from small molecules. Now, the same concerns apply to rare diseases. So as you noted, under the law, orphan drugs designated for only one disease or condition and approved for only that one disease or condition are exempt from negotiations, and any subsequent designations or research on indication expansions and approval of additional indications would not be exempt. So we do think this has some serious unintended consequences for follow-on R&D for existing orphan drugs, which I believe leads into maybe the second question you wanted me to cover.
Yes, thank you so much. Before we jump on, I think the second question, I'm also curious about, the work that you are doing within bio. I understand that you already have a position regarding the Orphan Cures Act, but on the flip side, I think there are ongoing debates with regards to, no evidence of these unintended consequences yet. So I'm curious about some of the specific work that maybe we could talk about specifically with the member organizations that you have in bio to support Orphan Cures Act and build possible evidence on the effects that you just mentioned.
Okay, happy to take that question. Okay. In terms of the advocacy that we're doing for reforms, there are multiple tracks that we are working on. So one is we are having a lot of conversations and doing a lot of examinations about how the law is impacting business practices and investment practices. Now, at this time, as the first negotiation round has just occurred, the thing that we're trying to track is a bit tricky because you're tracking things that decisions that may impact about things that aren't going to move forward. So you're almost like trying to track a negative, and it may take a year or so for us to really see that lag be fully realized in public documents and in trend data. But no less, but certainly we are hearing about a lot of companies having conversations about how they're going to reprioritize their research and development portfolios based on some loss incentives and some downward pressures under this law. There's a lot of estimates, and I'm sure John might cover in his talk that show that. We also, by nature of working with the small pre-revenue companies very closely, that puts us, we talk a lot and engage a lot with the investor community. So we are talking to them as well about, and we regularly track venture capital dollars, which are sort of the canary in the coal mine trends, which really show their different behaviors. So again, we don't have that data today, but that is what we will be tracking and looking for in the days to come. Now, unfortunately, what you don't want to have happen is wait for trend data. You don't want to wait too long to see trend data to really use common sense to fix market distortions created under this law, because that just means time lost for patients and time lost for the development of treatments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Esham. I think with the collaboration that we've done, we could hopefully see more of that data come to fruition in the next couple of months. And of course, John, who's going to be our next speaker, will talk more about that. But lastly, before we move on, in the proposed legislation of the Orphan Cures Act, how do you foresee the policy balancing, again, what we are talking about, the need for innovation in rare disease treatments, and of course, affordability and accessibility of these treatments for patients?
Yeah, great question. One thing, it's important to remember that prior to the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, which provided some incentives for the development of treatments and cures for rare diseases, there was little to no investment in or development of medicines for rare diseases. So it's also important to note that even though significant progress has been made, with more than 600 orphan drugs and biologics approved since that time, since 1983, there's still more than 90% of rare diseases without an approved treatment. So there's a lot more work to be done. And so the Cures Act, recently introduced in a bipartisan manner and in both the House and Senate, would protect the existing incentives and boost research into treatments for the 30 million Americans suffering from one of the more than 7,000 rare diseases. And specifically, as you noted in your opening statements, it would amend the IRA to ensure that orphan drugs treating one or more diseases or conditions could be exempt from negotiations, which would restore encouragements for investing in orphan drugs generally, and certainly for additional orphan drug indications. In terms of the balancing to access, we do need to advance legislation that continues to decrease out-of-pocket expenses for patients and their families at the counter. There's a lot of debate with the public that often uses list prices, which biopharmaceutical companies do not actually receive after going through significant rebate and discount processes with public and private payers. But unfortunately, in our view, not enough of those savings are realized by the patient. So we are certainly working to advocate for policies to better ensure that pharmacy benefit managers utilize the rebate system in a way that should be celebrated by putting patients first and allowing patients to actually benefit and see decreased expenses at the pharmacy counter. So, in closing, I think in my comments, I think it's important. It feels as though sometimes we don't think that the medical research and development ecosystem can be broken. And I think believing this is a mistake. The ecosystem itself relies on a number of policies working in concert. And in the development and enactment of these policies, we must always consider what will help us advance our scientific understanding of diseases, what policies are needed to ensure the effective transfer of technology to the private sector, what policies are needed to ensure there are incentives for the significant investment required to develop cures and treatments, what policies are needed to ensure effective and patient-centric drug development and review processes, and of course, most important of all, what's going to ensure patients have access to medicines and that they themselves do not have decreased expenses at the counter, at the pharmacy counter when they go to pick up their medicine. These policies need to be viewed holistically. Can't break a spoke in a wheel and expect it to keep functioning in the same way. So again, it's imperative that we do balance these imperatives, that we have the right level of incentives for investment in rare diseases. And I think that under the current law, we are at risk of losing the current momentum, and thousands of patients suffering from rare diseases may go a lot longer without approved medicines.
Thank you, Dr. Esham. I think we started off this conversation really touching into the complexities of some of the policies that we want, and we will move on to our next speakers. So we'll come back later if there are if our audience would want some questions, please type it in our Q&A, and hopefully we have time for Dr. Esham to answer it at the end of this call. But thank you again, Dr. Esham. So let's move on to our next speaker. Good afternoon to you there over, John.
Hey, Erika, how's it going?
Good. Thank you so much for your time, and we appreciate that you will be here on this call. So I understand that you are getting ready with your PowerPoint already, so let's get on it.
Fantastic. You can see this? Everybody can see this?
Yes, I think
Great.
you are sharing the presenter view, yes.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much, and Erika and Carter and Mason, it's a pleasure to be on this webinar with you both. Thought I would start off just a bit of a background of Todd Strategy Group. We are a strategic consulting firm focused on legislative and regulatory guidance and advocacy for stakeholders. A lot of the work we're doing right now is on the IRA implementation, understanding the consequences and impacts of it. And, we came up with this presentation on the orphan drug development specifically. So here's some background on the Orphan Drug Act. And, I don't want to spend too much time on this, especially since we kind of went over it. But, a key takeaway for me is that Congress identified that there was, a market failure, or as Carter said, that there wasn't investment in these rare diseases and getting cures to patients. And in 1983, Congress decided to do something about that and came up with the Orphan Drug Act. And, this gave incentives to manufacturers to invest in rare disease and bring these drugs to market. One other thing I would like to highlight, and especially as we talk about Orphan Cures Act, is that, the work didn't stop in 1983. So there were several times that the Orphan Drug Act was amended, and it was as recently, well, it was within 2 years that they amended it they got rid of a provision over pricing. So, it's one of those things that as we think about the IRA, I do think there's an opportunity to kind of educate lawmakers on how you may have intended this, there are some problems, and here's a fix. And one of those fixes is Orphan Cures Act. As Carter and Erika spoke about, the treatment of orphan drugs in the legislative text, it is only the exemption is a narrow one. It's only for one rare disease or condition. I highlight here how it's a legislative choice that the drafters in Congress made, that instead of crosswalking the definition to all orphan drugs, they specifically said certain orphan drugs. So that's what we're facing in when we try to mitigate what this narrow definition is. In the legislative text, they did decide to say only certain orphan drugs. And one of the things that the Orphan Cures Act, as we discussed, would mitigate is it would expand it to orphan drugs with more than one designation. Predictably, CMS in initial guidance they interpreted this as designated as a drug for only one rare disease or condition. But however, they did have an opportunity for stakeholders to comment, and this was in March 2023, so a little bit over a year ago. They did state that they are considering whether there are additional actions CMS can take in implementing a negotiation program to best support orphan drug development. So it is notable that they did think that there was opportunities that they could better enhance orphan drug development, even though they were somewhat limited by that statute saying that it's only certain orphan drugs are exempted. Stakeholders, including NORD, which I found very helpful, came up with a lot of responses on how CMS could help orphan drug development. Here are just a couple of them. There were hundreds of responses. What one I wanted to highlight was setting the MFP, that's the maximum fair price, at the ceiling for rare disease drugs. And I think that's noteworthy as we think about kind of what a potential Republican administration or a different HHS, as they're implementing IRA, they could potentially develop a policy to just say, okay, for rare disease drugs, we're going to have it at the maximum fair price, and that creates a sort of consistency and expectation for manufacturers. Right now, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the environment, as we touched upon before. Accelerated approvals are under threat. Every day politicians on both sides are talking negatively about the biopharmaceutical industry. So anything that there is some certainty, I think, is a potential mitigation factor there. The final guidance reiterated the CMS's main interpretation. Broadly aligns. There are some basically any drug with designations for more than one rare disease or condition does not qualify for exclusion. So that was also expected from initial guidance. And here we get to the Orphan Cures Act, and that's Representative John Joyce. He's one of the sponsors of the bill. This is him a couple weeks ago, Rare Disease Week, on the floor, supporting the Orphan Cures Act. It expands the exemption and it creates a new treatment of former orphan drugs provision on timing. So that's kind of the legislative hook and what advocates are moving forward on. I have a couple appendix slides, and I'm happy to share all of these with everybody, but this is just and I know I'm running out of time, but these are just two slides on kind of companies, specifically AstraZeneca in their lawsuit, and some comments from BMS, AZ, and Canade Biopharma on how it impacts them specifically. So I thought that might be helpful to share with everybody later.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. I think you perfectly outlined and created this amazing deck that goes through the whole story and history of why we are here right now and why we are in this webinar. I want to be wary of our time, but I know we have a few minutes to answer this question. Maybe before moving on to Mason, it's the same thing I asked Dr. Esham. In the proposed legislation of the Orphan Cures Act, something you touched on a while ago, how do you foresee this balancing really the need for innovation in rare disease treatments and affordability and accessibility of these treatments? I know you went through the legislation and specific examples, but maybe just to close this portion before we go back and talk to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's part of the broader issue of reform efforts at the counter, as Dr. Esham said. There's some other bills, the All Copays Count Act, for example, which, would really impact patients at the counter and ensuring that manufacturer assistance would be able to be applied. I don't think it's one specific thing, but it's a broader landscape of just PBM reform. I would also say reforming, making sure that delinking, all of this I think is kind of combined part of the solution, and there's probably not just one aspect of it.
And I think that's what makes our work very exciting, just the challenges and complexities that we're all encountering. So again, for our participants, if you have any questions for John, you could cue it in the Q&A portion, write it out in the box, and then we'll get right on it later on. So last but not the least, Mason. Mason, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Erika. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and let me flash up my slides here.
Yeah. So I understand that Nord's perspective on this is with the 2 technical corrections of the IRA. Now, I saw a preview of your presentation because as moderator, I have that privilege. So I'm very, very excited to learn more about this as, someone who is still building my knowledge as well on these policies and their impacts. So thank you again, Mason.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to be here and participate alongside such esteemed company. I want to give a little bit of overview about who Nord is before diving into the rest of the presentation. If my slides will cooperate. There we go. So since 1983, Nord has advocated for rare disease patients across the country. We are rooted in the advocacy that spurred a movement resulting in the passage of the world's first law incentivizing drug development for rare diseases, the Orphan Drug Act of 1983. We continue to fight for life-changing laws, policies, and programs today. And this is just our mission statement up on the slide. We improve the health and well-being of people with rare diseases by driving advances in care, research, and policy. So why is talking about rare disease so important? It's estimated that around 30 million Americans, about 1 in 10 people, have a rare disease. For years, rare disease patients had few or no treatment options. Studying rare diseases is more challenging than for common diseases for a number of reasons. Most rare diseases have heterogeneous disease manifestations and progressions. Many rare diseases lack natural history studies, and it can be really challenging to identify patients for a clinical trial, as well as many rare disease patients struggle to find an accurate diagnosis for their condition in the first place. The median rare disease patient takes between 5 and 7 years to receive an accurate diagnosis. And that's, dozens of different doctors, specialists. It's a really frustrating and time-consuming process that also hinders access to timely care. The passage of the ODA helped to change the treatment paradigm. Law created orphan drug designations, which serve as incentives for manufacturers to invest in rare disease research, and enhanced market exclusivity provisions. Since the passage of the ODA, we have seen a dramatic uptick in both orphan drug designations and approvals, also known as indications. Indeed, since 2018, over 50% of new molecular entity approvals have been for rare diseases. However, despite the increase in rare disease treatment, over 95% of known rare diseases lack an FDA-approved treatment. At Nord, we really strive to balance the tremendous unmet need within the rare disease community and the need for continued innovation with the access challenges that our community faces. The reality is rare disease drugs are really expensive across the board. Studies have consistently found that rare disease drugs are more expensive for patients than for common diseases. Indeed, a 2023 study of common and rare approvals between 2017 and 2021 found that approvals with an orphan indication, that is, drugs that treat a rare disease, were over 175% more expensive than their common counterparts. Similar trends exist in drugs for chronic use, oncology, and genetic disorders, all three of which frequently have rare components. A 2019 survey of rare disease patients and caregivers found that 76% of all respondents had experienced financial challenges due to their own or their family members' rare diagnosis, while 30% of those respondents classified their financial challenges as extreme or great. And I can say from personal experience, we receive calls, emails, messages on the daily with patients asking about patient assistance programs, talking about looking for ways to identify how they can afford their medication or receive appropriate access. Within the Inflation Reduction Act, we are heartened to see some positive changes that are likely to have a significant impact on rare disease patients' direct out-of-pocket costs, such as the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap in Part D and the Medicare Prescription Payment Plan, also known as MP3 or smoothing, depending on who you're talking to, that allows patients to pay for their Part D medications over time rather than all upfront. However, we are concerned that some of the changes that have been elaborated upon previously regarding the limitations of the orphan drug exclusion from the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program could adversely impact patients. To ground the rest of our conversation, I think it's really important to define a couple of key terms that we've heard throughout the course of the day so far. As mentioned previously, a designation is granted really early in that drug development process. Designations unlock those R&D incentives that make studying orphan drugs more attractive. Since the passage of the ODA, there have been over 6,500 orphan designations granted. Indications, on the other hand, allow the manufacturer to market the product. This is the end stage of FDA review after determination the product is both safe and effective. Indications are typically more specific to the population that they are treating, while a designation application may suggest that a product has potential to treat rare disease X. A granted indication is typically along the lines of treatment of rare disease X in population under 12 with a confirmed mutation. Since the passage of the ODA, there have been about 1,150 approved indication, a fraction of the total number of designations granted. To recap, designations only help further future research on the product. They do not allow the manufacturer to market the product, which is only granted by an indication. Under current law, a drug becomes negotiation eligible under the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Program if it hits a few criteria. It must have over $200 million in annual Medicare spending, and that's indexed for inflation as we move into future years. Does not have existing or imminent generic or biosimilar competition, and must have been on the market for 9 years for small molecule drugs or 13 years for biologics. Current law also includes a limited exclusion for orphan drugs that are one indication tied to one orphan designation. However, assuming a drug qualifies for the negotiation program under all other categories, as soon as a manufacturer seeks a designation for a rare disease on the drug, the exclusion is lost. Remember, those designations do not allow the manufacturer to market the product. It only provides research credits. The loss of the exclusion means that manufacturers have a limited incentive to consider repurposing the drug. A significant number of orphan drugs receive follow-on indications. The average time between first indication and second indication is about 4.5 years. Between 2003 and 2022, 23% of novel orphan drug approvals received a separate follow-on indication. In this case, a follow-on indication would be a separate indication that is not tied to the initial designation. I think John did a really good job of outlining that in the last section of the presentation. So, for example, let's assume that a drug is granted a designation in 2015 for rare disease X and an indication for rare disease X in 2018. A follow-on indication would not include additional indications tied to the initial designation of rare disease X, such as different age populations and things like that. We would consider a follow-on indication to be an approved indication for rare disease Y in 2020. Again, rare disease X and rare disease Y are two separate rare diseases who have received two separate indications. Drug repurposing offers significant promise, as recognized when the White House announced about $48 million into drug repurposing for rare diseases through ARPA-H in February earlier this year. Ramifications of the current law will extend beyond just the Medicare age population. If a manufacturer wanted to seek a designation for another rare disease exclusively impacting the pediatric population, the exclusion would be lost all the same. We are concerned that current law could threaten the existing rare disease drug development ecosystem. So to rectify some of the issues that we have seen in the current legislation, we're proposing two small technical corrections meant to protect the Orphan Drug Act by avoiding disincentives to study orphan drugs for additional rare diseases. And apologies, I understand that the graphic is very small. The second technical correction is a little bit Byzantine and arcane, so I'm more than happy to have a follow-up conversation, but I'm going to talk about it more in general terms at this point. Our technical corrections would remove the disincentive to research additional rare diseases after the first approval and restore exclusivity protections granted by the Orphan Drug Act. As an umbrella organization advocating on behalf of all individuals living with rare disease and impacted by rare disease, we are concerned that artificially contrived limits to designations will result in R&D efforts concerted around rare diseases that are easier to study or research on products that are more likely to succeed. We also want to ensure that the sanctity of the market exclusivity granted by the ODA remains intact. Just look at the number of rare disease drugs approved prior to the passage of the ODA. Incentives really matter. We are advocating for these two small technical corrections for a few reasons. First, we want to push a solution that is feasible within the context of our broader policy goals and the reality of the current Congress. I'm not sure how many of you watched the House E&C hearing on the other day on rare diseases, but finding bipartisan consensus on any major policy shifts within the IRA, we think is going to be really, really difficult. Second, we want to ensure that we are appropriately balancing patient access to medication with the need for continued innovation. Treatments for rare diseases are amazing and provide hope for millions of patients across the country, but we have to recognize too many patients are unable to afford their medications. Third, we need additional data to make recommendations on how best to expand the orphan exclusion. Our technical corrections are supported by over 170 patient organizations, and we believe they present a feasible, common sense solution to ensuring rare disease patients are not inadvertently harmed by misaligned incentives. That is it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So with such an informed position regarding the IRA, I'm curious to know the process of how NORD works closely with patients or patient advocacy groups, as you were saying a while ago, to gain insights and perspectives that led to the organization to arrive at these two technical corrections. So I'm only asking because I think we could learn a lot from you. I think NORD sets out a great example of balancing the innovator perspective and patient perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So we've been doing both surveys within the patient community, talking to providers. We have a set of what we're calling centers of excellence across the country, which are kind of how they house specialists that treat rare diseases. Oftentimes, there are only one or two physicians across the country that have the requisite knowledge to treat the rare disease. And I think a lot of the feedback that we've received are, kind of as I mentioned in the presentation, rare disease drugs are awesome and they really are life-changing for so many patients, but they're so expensive. And so I think really trying to balance the continued incentive to innovate with expanding the designation piece to unlimited designations, and then kind of fixing that timing piece, which we actually think is just a little bit of not a typo, but it was not really congressional intent. And we think that those two are really kind of within the scope of what we can do in the current Congress.
And we see the importance, as you outlined, of these two technical corrections, but you did point out something that I want to touch on more in-depthly, and that is building evidence. So how do we gather more data, build more evidence that would, one, show that this could actually address equity, but also inclusivity and drug development and access for patients?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I would love to put out a plug for any manufacturers out there who are interested in partnering with NORD to share data. We've been doing some analysis on the back end, and we'd love to partner with you and kind of get more of a sense as to how the current law is impacting the drug development ecosystem writ large. I think on the equity piece, one thing that we are really concerned about is it's that low-hanging fruit. Right now, those single orphan drug exclusion with the single indication tied to a single designation really incentivizes only pursuing research into rare diseases that are easier to treat. And there are so many rare diseases that are really challenging to study, whether that be rare diseases with kind of heterogeneous disease presentation and the lack of natural history study. Doing that basic groundwork in order to get the information that allows a manufacturer to kind of get into the nitty gritty and present a plausible hypothesis to the FDA in order to receive an orphan designation would be disincentivized with that. So I think, yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Mason. I love how we went through, the Orphan Cures Act and then also these technical corrections, and you really bring a different perspective to this conversation. So I'd like to now open the floor for Q&A. So I'd like to call on Carter and John back on stage. Our virtual stage. All right, so if our participants have any questions, please queue them in our Q&A box. But actually, I'm going to start. So I think this is, our policy program here. It's interesting because we bring an intersection of different types of collaborators and stakeholders. But maybe moving forward, how could you foresee stakeholders such as policy directors, policymakers, industry, and patient advocacy groups collaborate more effectively to shape these current policies and ensure that they fully address the complexities that we've been talking about this entire hour, the complexities of all different policies in developing access and treatments for rare diseases. So Dr. Esham?
That's a great question, and I will certainly look to Mason and John to jump in here as well. And what I'd like to first say is, I've been working in Washington, D.C. for 24 years, not to date myself, but several years. And I think that what's not maybe readily apparent to those outside of D.C. and just getting one viewpoint from like news on D.C., we actually collaborate a lot. I am proud to say that, we at Bio work very closely with NORD and learn from NORD and support NORD's efforts and vice versa. We work very closely with academic centers, scientists. We engage with NIH. It is actually a lot more collaborative than I think maybe the general public appreciates. So that's great news for everybody on the call. And to be honest, that's where the best policy ideas come from. So what you're hearing today is, not misalignment, but, alignment on something that we share a concern about, and we are learning from one another and supporting one another's efforts to fix what we believe could be a drag on development in orphan drugs, for example. So again, it really is just by getting the best and brightest together. And I'm not saying I'm one of those, but I can certainly convene them to really come up with solutions and then move forward and advocate them in a collaborative manner. But I'll look to maybe Mason and Jason, Mason and John, sorry, John, to add their thoughts here as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to build off that, Carter. I think that, great points. One thing that I think is really important, and maybe this is just, the scars of hundreds of hours of Hill visits talking, but I think some basic education for Hill staffers is really important. Talking about designations and indications, they're not really commonplace language. And I think that without kind of that foundational, knowledge base, it's easy to get the two of those things confused. When you're talking about an indication tied to a designation or multiple indications tied to a single designation, it's challenging. And also, I think, part of the reason I skipped over the timing piece of our technical corrections is that it's another, just challenging topic to explain in a couple of minutes. I think the average, it usually takes about an hour to fully walk through all the examples and have, full understanding of the timing piece. So I tried to spare you all from that. So I think education is great. And also just leveraging personal connections. I think it's really easy in the healthcare sector to play up one side is a villain or one side is, the savior or something like that. And so limiting the opportunity for political cannon fire, I think, is really important. So leveraging those behind the scenes connections, just ensuring that we have general understanding and trying to, just provide that baseline education I think are really important.
Yeah, I'll just add, kudos to what's already been done, getting a bipartisan legislative vehicle as a starting point to, whether it's this Congress or the next one, but, having those congressional champions meeting with them, and just, going off what Mason said, I think in this issue specifically, kind of personal stories, make the issue personal. How did these, rare disease drugs change your or a loved one's life? Educate the lawmakers and their staffs, on how vital this is, particularly.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Esham, John, and Mason. I'd like to be wary of everyone's time, but if we do have more questions coming in, I understand that in your presentations, you've also left out your emails, so we could talk to each other, collaborate, and continue this conversation offline. But I am so grateful for all our guest speakers today. I've certainly learned a lot from all the presentations and the questions. And I think this is just the start of an ongoing change and call to action on what we should be able to do. So hopefully my research as well will be able to do that. And thank you again for all the participants who have joined. And thank you to Molly and Josh for the introduction. And we do have one more question. I'd like to answer this before we close. So we have one question asking, have you found physicians and or scientists who are, let's say, legislators that have been helpful as well in promoting this cause and promoting, the orphan drug designation or indication?
I do think so. There's a doc caucus in Congress. Dr. Joyce, as the sponsor of Orphan Cures, is a doctor. So I do think so, but that's definitely part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something in this conversation as well that we would want to also pull in physicians who are advocates and who sees, patients day to day. So thank you for that question. Mason or Dr. Esham?
Well, I mean, John said it best. I mean, certainly, when you have members of Congress that are have a medical background, that is always there's benefits to how you start the conversation and sort of the level you can quickly, the deep levels you can quickly go into with those members. But I would also point out, in addition to a doc caucus, there's a rare disease caucus, because you can never underestimate the passion by people impacted by a rare disease. And I'm sure Mason can speak much more eloquently than I can on that. But, when you have members of Congress that have personal family or friends that are suffering from these diseases, they too are ready to solve problems, and ready to engage with ideas about how to solve those problems.
Yeah, Carter, you took the words right out of my mouth. That Rare Disease Caucus has been so crucial to advocating for so many kind of different rare disease issues across the spectrum. It's led by Congresswoman Matsui and Congressman Bill Arakis. Both have been kind of invaluable partners and are really interested and invested in the rare disease space. So I think, yeah, those two above all else come to mind as we kind of worked in a bipartisan manner to figure out what's best for the rare disease community.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think, talking about physicians and our other healthcare providers in this conversation is really something that we need to work on and we need to work with rather. So thank you again. And I really appreciate this time, Mason, John, and Dr. Esham. We will now end this webinar. Thank you so much for the participants. Again, this is just the start of an ongoing collaborative effort that we will continuously do within biodesign and outside with our lovely stakeholders here, our different policy directors, analysts, and of course, working with different organizations. So I'd like to thank everybody on this call, all the participants, and excited to see where our work will take us. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.